Next slide, perfect. So, I mean, two reasons that Laura and I wanted to show this slide of GIs. One is it shows off the new materials for the ambassador program, which I think are really, really beautiful and clean. And I think it's a difficult thing to have something that looks detailed, but is still easy to read. And also, I think all of us in the trade need a reminder of where this dynamic process is. We know that there's research being done all the time. We know that different special terroirs are being identified, not just from a geographical stance, but also from a wine stance. More and more, we're being able to identify wines in the glass from different regions. And this is changing and progressing every year. So this is the current state of the GIs. And let's look at some climatic truths. Is it a cool climate? We know, I mean, and most of us that are on the call are from BC, or we're Canadians that are very familiar with what happens in BC. And it's so interesting to travel and have people think that because we're Canadians, everything's cool all the time. And of course, for those people making wine, especially in the Okanagan and for regions that are on the east side of the Coast Mountains, this is not a cool climate. This is a climate of extremes. It's marginal for sure, but it's extremes, and the season is short and intense. And I think, well, we'll see this both in 20, and we certainly saw it in 19, weather events within that season can make a whole difference. But every year, even though we know that the annual weather patterns are going to make a difference, they're going to leave their mark on the wine, there are some truths to the climate, especially for the separation between those that are really coastal and maritime, Fraser Valley, Vancouver Island, and then the Okanagan, and even hotter, more intense regions. So those are the backdrop on which we can put the annual weather conditions. So let's look a little bit more detail at that for the Okanagan. So 2020, it's really interesting because, as I mentioned before, the growing degree days are pretty similar to what we've seen in the last couple of years, but it's so much about when these growing degree days happen. And it's interesting to have 19 and 20 back to back, because in many regions, they're almost identical with their growing degree days, but they came at radically different times. So they're kind of flipped in that in 20, it was a cool and wet spring. Flowering was awkward and inconsistent, which of course resulted in lower yields for many grape varieties. And I'd love for the panelists to talk a little bit about that, where there's some grape varieties that were more affected than others. And then we went into a summer that was fairly classic without the heat spikes. And notably for the second year in a row here, there wasn't really an effect of smoke cloud cover or smoke in general, fires in general. It was the fall that made this vintage. So unlike 2019, and I'm sorry to bring it up. I know Kathy, we talked about your Gewürztraminer yesterday that suffered from the Thanksgiving frost in 2019. So 19 was a vintage that was going along well and then abruptly stopped in early October. Here in the late fall in 2020, from mid-August on, beautiful sunshine, warm temperatures. So of course, this is going to some grape varieties, maybe over others, depending on when they ripen. And I'd love for you, the panelists, to keep that in your mind when we're talking about the wines later on.
Barb, sorry to interrupt. There's a few feedback from the attendees with some blurry voiceover, some echo.
Oh.
Do you by any chance happen to have earbuds close by?
Come on. 1 year into Zoom. Give me 30 seconds. Can you talk about yourself amongst yourselves, panelists?
Yes.
Can you do it without the moderator? I think you can. I'm not trying to get myself fired, but I'm going to get myself.
Fantastic. So everyone's tuning in from home today. Nice backdrops. No wine bottles, no vineyards.
I tried. We all tried. Well, I think we all tried. I had two possibles and I thought it was going to happen, but I also downloaded a Zoom update yesterday. And I think that's what made it decide my device didn't accept backgrounds. So sorry. Sorry. I have a fantastic one of Bud Break and an embarrassing story to tell. A couple of years ago, I posted on Twitter a picture of Bud Break, and I said, I love this stage in the vineyard. It looks like butterflies perched on the wire. In fact, the French have a name for this, papillon sur fille. It's actually one of their phenological designations. And I got a lot of, I made it up. I don't know if the French do, they should. But yeah, I had a lot of activity on Twitter. It looks exactly like butterflies on the wires though, so.
Oh, that's lovely.
Back to you, Barb.
All right.
Hey, how's that? How's the voice? How's the sound? Better?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Perfect.
Sometimes people complain that my hair goes swish swish over the earbuds, but anyway. Where are we? Oh, beautiful, beautiful data. So again, true, but perhaps misleading data showing just really how average 2020 was, hitting it in the middle since 1998 to 2020. Really, as far as degree day accumulation, it was right smack dab in the middle. But what's important, of course, is when that heat came. So these are, we'll show as we normally do, data for Summerland and then data for Soyuz. But they have similar patterns. So let's go to the next slide and look at a month-to-month breakdown. So it really follows what we were talking about earlier, that in the early going, it wasn't the coolest temperature-wise, even of recent years, but it was a slower start to the season. And then some good heat accumulation during the midsummer, but then really late August, September, October, beautiful, beautiful sunshine, great ripening conditions. And it's interesting, I don't have the graphs to show you today, but if you look at, say, a 50-year average in Summerland or in the South or even around Kelowna, you know, in the beginning of the season, the temperatures and the degree days were a little bit less than even the 50-year norm. But for the last 6 weeks, 8 weeks of the summer, it shot up and there's quite a difference, quite a bit above the norm. So let's look at the Soyuz numbers. You know, I always try to think too, what was this vintage like? You know, and lots of us, we try to do that with European wines as well. And I don't know what it is in the human mind. We try to compare it to something else, but the more and more you research, you find out that the vintage is really not like anything else. And I was trying to find, is it like 19? No, because the early frost was such a big part of that vintage. The pattern looks like 15, but the temperatures were way higher. Does it look a little bit like 14? Well, 14 was very slow in the beginning to get going. So every vintage is truly unique. Let's look at the month by month for Soyuz. And similar patterns. So you can see, it's just interesting to see it compared to 19. If you look at the October stats there, and this is October, like normally when you calculate growing degree days, you'll often leave out October because you don't expect there to be a lot of ripening, but you can see that we actually gained quite a few degrees over the last few days, few weeks of the ripening cycle. Okay, let's look at some specific weather station data. And this is interesting, and I Laura knows I can spend just days and weeks looking for this data and comparing it, and it's interesting. And always with statistics, you have to be a bit careful, because these degree days, you'll notice if you were looking at them on the other slide, are slightly less than the ones that we showed on the graphs, because these degree days only go to the end of September. So you're not getting the additional ripeness in the additional ripening days in October, but it still gives you an idea. And as you can see, we're really right on the average for the last few years overall, with a little bit cooler, particularly around the Penticton Airport. And Val, I wasn't sure for Gold Hill, because when I kind of looked at the map, the winery vis-a-vis the weather stations, it looked like you were almost closer to Oliver, but I know that the vineyards are so warm. I took the Soyuz data, so I don't know if that works for you or not.
Yeah, I would say we're more like a Soyuz, especially East Bank of Soyuz, very similar. Whereas Oliver, you get so much steepness happening that you really get much cooler heading north from our site. So I would say that is more accurate to consider a Soyuz. Like our weather station data is more like a Soyuz than Oliver.
But that's what it felt like to me. So geographically it didn't look that way, but it feels like they're warm. And I think another interesting thing, just to have the data clean and laid out like this, is to show the difference controlling the vintage of all of these sites in the Okanagan. So, I mean, this really supports, and this is not even considering the geology, not even considering, things like altitude, etc. But even with growing degree days, you can see the difference between these three regions. So interesting and exciting, and more to explore every day.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide, please. So, Graham Pierce, winemaker at Kitsch Wines, thank you for joining us. And thank you I've got a delicious looking wine that I haven't tried this morning yet, Block Party, which looks like lots of fun. I would like you to talk about specifically in your vineyards, what happened in 20, and then I'm curious about some other things if we have time. So why don't you set us up for what was 2020 like for you?
Great, thanks so much, Barb, and thanks Laura and the team at Wines of BC for putting this all together. It's great to connect with everybody. It's been, a quiet year for all of us, just tucked away, dealing with vineyards and wines and whatnot. But we definitely miss all the interaction with awesome trade and media and stuff like that. So, yeah. And thanks for your great overview of the year. That was really interesting. It's generally what we saw, but the big difference for us is, and I hope the audio is okay. I don't have headphones here, so I hope you guys can all hear me.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, good. The big difference for us is that we really need to go back to the fall of 2019 that Kathy, you alluded to. We had a frost then. And for us, I wasn't here yet. I've only just been at Kitsch actually, it's my 1-year anniversary. So interestingly, but
Congratulations.
but with the frost in the fall of 2019, we still had grapes on here and all the leaves on and everything. So the plants didn't really get a great chance to winterize going into winter. So that had obviously a bit of a negative effect on the plants. And then we had a much colder winter than some of the other areas. We're about 90 meters above the lake up here. It's a little bit cooler. And our property has a lot of flats and then a slope. So everything on the slope, which is a lot of Chardonnay and Riesling, was fine. And a lot of the stuff on the flat, we saw winter damage where we had dead buds and even dead trunks. So I knew right away we were going to have to do a lot of retraining and in some cases pulling plants out, and a pretty major rework of about 4 acres of land. So a little bit behind to start, a little bit of a rough beginning. And that was literally on my first day. I was starting to see a fair bit of bud damage and buds that weren't going to pop because we were so much later last year. I don't know what it's like for you guys, but our shoots are already about this big or so. And last year about this time, we were really just starting to see bud break up here. And then I think you were accurate with your slides in terms of having a kind of a warm and wet spring. And that's not the end of the world for us. We obviously aware of mold and mildew pressures in that time, but the growing was going fairly good. But when we had bloom, we had a little bit of wet, windy weather, and we didn't really get a good fruit set out of it. So we were down in terms of not really as many shoots, so not as many buds. And then the clusters that we did have were going to be a little bit smaller. And then again, they didn't really size up all that much either. So it was kind of the triumvirate. Then, like you said,
I'm sorry, that would be across all of your grape varieties generally?
yeah. So, and up here we have Chard, Riesling, Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris. So, kind of classic varieties for this area, all realistic things that, we can bring in here at good ripeness. Where we were on the flat, the crop was going to be way down. So we weren't really even looking to estimate that. We were just trying to retrain and see what we can do and think about the future on those sites. And then the majority of the vineyard looked pretty good. So yeah, that's more referring to the Chard and the Riesling for that. Good question. So the vineyard set up quite well, but we just knew we were down. We didn't know quite what we were down. And of course, you guys have probably already heard this. Everybody was kind of down across the board. So yeah, we got through that. And then, like you said, we had a really good July, August, September. September is the most critical month for sure for, for ripening in this area, kind of make or break. If you're a little bit behind, you can really get caught up. And that's when you get the great flavor development, when you're kind of, 20 to 25 C. So yeah, it was an interesting year. It's my first year here, but things went to go pretty well. All came in. We really saw very, very ripe fruit at quite low brix, quite low acid, and also quite low pH. So, you were saying you're trying to compare it to a year. From my perspective, and I've been making wine about 20 years now, those metrics have kind of never really came in like that. I mean, often you have very, very high sugars, but your acid drops way out and then your pH goes right up. Or, you do have lower sugars and you still get like say 10 and 11, everything kind of came in at lower sugars. They were really, really good wines, but generally the acids were up and we kind of had those winemakers, so we had to deal with that a little bit. Whereas last year, Riesling and stuff coming in at 8 to 9 grams of acid at, 22 brix kind of thing. So it was kind of a little bit different, very, very interesting. And we had smaller berries and very concentrated flavors. So the wines that we were able to make were quite good. The problem was there's just not that much of them out there. So
it's all a balance, isn't it? And I wanted to ask you too, so it's interesting, and this is, it maybe feeds into what you're saying about, some grape varieties do better as far as quality goes. Some really, really struggled, the ones that you had on the flatter areas, etc.
Mhm.
So I have in front of me a bottle of the Block Party, which is what, certainly years ago anyway, we would think would be one of the real symbols of the Okanagan Valley. A refreshing white patio blend with enough acidity to be quenching, but not that's going to really, not that's super austere. One thing that's maybe different about the Block Party is it's dry on the palate. So how much, when you're making a wine like this, and it's a fun wine, a quaffable wine, etc., how much does vintage play into this? How much do you rely on this as being sort of something you can make in every vintage? How does that play into a vintage, particularly like 2020?
Yeah, really interesting question. I mean, the nice part with those types of blends, and I've worked with blends, quite a bit in my career, is you can often, kind of capitalize / mitigate the circumstances. So if something is going to come in and maybe a little bit out of spec, then you can look at another variety that you're going to come in and maybe, like say you think the acid's going to be too high in the Riesling, then maybe you hold the Pinot Gris slightly longer than that you would have. And especially in a normal year with high acids, probably going to mean low sugar. So then if you have a little bit of higher sugar on something else where the acid drops, it's not going to be a problem with having too much alcohol in that wine. So definitely big picture, you're looking at those types of things where there can be some kind of gains and where you can make the better blend. And then the beauty of those types of wines really is that the blend can really change the composure of the wine big time. So we're always going to look at all of the parameters once we get those wines made. With this wine, my first year here, not really knowing exactly how everything was going to come in and what the different lots were going to give me. I didn't really want to do any co-ferments. I wanted to ferment everything separately, see how everything was going to play out, kind of pick for optimals for the most part. And also I didn't see any kind of red flags that I thought, I better make some sort of remedial actions to do that blend. But I can definitely see that in the future, and kind of as that skew grows as well too. So, like you said, it's a, really nice, interesting wine, very, very quaffable, good on its own. It's got a tiny bit of RS, but it really has a nice balance for the acid on that. So.
Yes, and I think this style, especially for the more northern GIs, is an important one. It's important to make wine that people want to drink and want to drink with abandon. It's absolutely delicious, and I really love the balance of the acidity, but also there's a body weight to it as well. There's a ripeness on the mid palate, which is super interesting.
Totally. And that's something that you can really build in when you are working on a blend like that, with having a bunch of different raw material by just kind of playing around with that. And I think some of that actually comes from the Pinot Gris, because that was something that came in quite ripe for us this year. It was really interesting.
It feels like it's drawn together with the Pinot Gris with some ripe stone fruit and pear. Absolutely delicious.
Kind of what I find really interesting about that is that I feel like all of the varieties are kind of represented in that blend as well too, which is kind of cool. It's not like anything got too washed out there. There's definitely the Riesling in there, and we sell and make a fair bit of Riesling up here, so I didn't want it to be too Riesling focused. But for the people who don't want to drink Riesling all the time, it's kind of a nice change with still lots of nice aromatics. But ultimately, very, very quaffable wine. So it gets a lot gets drunk out here on the patio on the nice grass there overlooking the lake.
Oh, I don't doubt that. And as I say, look out, because we are all coming up really, really soon.
We're all ready for you guys. We can't wait.
You say that now. You might be sick of us, but let's in a few months.
Not this year.
Can't wait to come up. All right. Well, let's move down south a little bit. And Kathy, I want you to talk about, of course, the Niramata Bench and what happened there in 2020. And I'm also curious because, we really have, especially at Hillside, you have a really, really good sense of what Naramata means, both in a terroir sense, in a wine flavor sense. And as you go through vintage after vintage, the fact that you can express Naramata so well through different grape varieties year after year, does vintage become more a part of that story or less a part of that story?
Oh, I would say more a part of that story for sure. We have a single vineyard Merlot series that we do 3 different vineyards. We don't make, or we don't bottle a wine from each of them every year, but in some years we do. And since we started doing that, it's been really easy, not just for us, but for our customers to see the impact of vintage variation. And they love, they love hearing the stories. They love hearing about the 2009 deep freeze in October, right? And how that impacted the reds. And, and then our coldest year ever, 2010 until 2011, and then they get very engaged in sort of teasing out the impact of those events and just the overall seasons, I would say. It's good too, because I just find I'm so focused on the wine at hand that I wipe the previous vintage out of my mind as quickly as possible. So it's really nice to have that record in the wine, right? And it's constantly sending me back to my spreadsheet that tells like average or the yearly bud break, bloom, veraison, and start of harvest, as well as the growing degree days. And because it's Excel, it will average those dates for me. And so, you know, constantly looking at that and going, oh, right, that's what happened, right? So
I love how you put that the record is in the wine, and that's we can never really separate the science from the art in this business, and that's what makes it so special. So on paper, certainly here, what did you say? It's the heart, it's the liver, it's the gut, it's the core of the Okanagan Valley.
The
here.
Niramata Bench is the heart.
The heart. And certainly on paper, if I'm looking at the data, it looks like overall, of course, you had the nice, the warm, beautiful days at the end of the season, but it looks overall like it was a cooler season than we've seen in the last few years. Do you think that's accurate, or were things different in your vineyard specifically?
No, I think that's accurate. I think that having that lack of heat in early and mid season is quite impactful, sometimes in a good way, actually. And I think 2020 will show that it is in a good way, because we didn't have to be concerned about, you know, the sugars going through the roof and high alcohol wines and that sort of thing. And so, especially for white wines, it really preserves aromatics. But then we had late season warmth, which is, you know, the best thing to happen for red wines. So you get that tannin ripening on the vine. And so I think that I think the white wines speak for themselves, and I think the red wines will show that it's quite an exceptional season. I'm not saying it was easy peasy. We had we actually had snow on October 23rd, by which I mean like 4 or 5 inches. Like the vines were covered, and maybe we were halfway through red harvest, and but the temperature wasn't cold enough to freeze the leaves or frost the leaves, right? So the snow melted, and the grapes just kept on ripening, and you know it ended up being, you know, one of our later pick dates on our Cab Sauv. So yeah, it turned out pretty well. It's not easy on growers or winemakers. It feels a little bit better to get the heat under your belt, so you don't have to worry so much. But also, you know, I think that when that happens, especially with contracted growers, then you struggle to get them to reduce crop and leaf pluck and that sort of thing, because they get cocky, right? So.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you would say with the late heat like that, it sounds to me like you can relax a little bit with the whites and pick them when they're in their sweet spot. When you want the Gewürztraminer to be ripe and heavy, sort of, like a real Alsace style, or do you want it to be higher in acid? You can have that decision. But the reds really, really benefit from this late heat. And I can't wait to try them. I haven't tried any reds yet because I haven't been up to barrel sample,
Yeah.
but we look forward to trying them for sure.
Just say when.
Okay, it'll be after May long weekend, but that's for sure.
Well, you can legally do that.
And I do have the Gewürztraminer 20 here, which has a lovely, very, very slightly brassy hue to it. And so for this wine in particular, on what were the factors that you used to decide when to harvest it?
So it's made up of 5 different vineyards, and the furthest north is, I think, just around the Penticton Naramata line, and so sorry, I don't have it in front of me, sort of the range of dates that we picked, right? It's very dependent on the vineyard itself. And we had, in 2019, we had an odd event that resulted in bud damage throughout the valley, in that we had such a warm January and then really cold February. So I might be off a bit on the months. And so the yield was really reduced, and it really hit two of my Gewürztraminer vineyards hard. Like I would say one of them I got less than 25% normal. And in 2020, it recovered, but not fully. So both of those years were characterized by low yields in the Goo vineyards. And so the 2019 and 2020 are actually very similar in flavor, which surprised me. But I think it might be the same cause. I think that concentration in the fruit is resulted in like a really tropical guava kind of flavor that, you know, carried on in 2020. So
nice. It is, and it's still very fresh. It still speaks to where it's from, absolutely, on the palate, but the nose is very complex and lots of ripe fruit, and along with the florals and the rose petals, there is that really, really tropical sense to it. Absolutely delicious.
thank you.
So thanks, Kathy. So Val, here you are in the south. Let's see your Val slide for Gold Hill Perfect. And this is really, as we talked about a little bit when I was showing the stats for the Soyuz weather station. I mean, this is warm. This is, you can't call this cool climate, and the wines do not manifest like they're cool climate. Some of the warmest vineyards in the country. This is really red wine territory. It'll be a few weeks before we can come and taste the reds out of barrel. But as you're really the red winemaker on the panel here, can you speak to what it was like for your Bordeaux varieties in particular on 2020?
Yeah, it was, you know, much as Kathy and Graham have said, you know, climate variation is incredible. And it's one of the most exciting things I've mentioned before about being a winemaker in the Okanagan in particular, is that every year is completely different. And although stylistically we're aiming for a certain style of wine, there's so much climate variation, and it's very exciting when you line up the wines, in particular when you're making, when you're working on a red wine program and you see all the verticals lined up and you taste them. It's like a true representation of what that climate was. And so even though you're aiming for something, you get this beautiful variation that allows you to play. And every year it's a completely different situation. And, you know, this is over 25 years of me going, what's going to happen this fall? But at Gold Hill, our focus is definitely on very expressive red wines, very bold, and our future is in Cabernet Franc. And we really want to explore that expression. And we have three different vineyards, but everything that we're doing is coming out of our Gold Hill Estate winery vineyard right now. And last year was so many things to be worried about. First, late winter, we had that big freeze, and in the South Okanagan, in particular, from Oliver South, a lot of the soils tend to be rich in sand and low in organic matter. So, you know, cold events can damage all the way down to the roots. And when you have vines that are deacclimatizing and getting ready for spring, and then you get a late winter cold event like we've had the last 2 years in February, you know, it's hard in mouth because the damage that can happen. Usually the buds are very tolerant of cold at that point, but it's the trunk, the phloem tissue that keeps the vine alive in the hot summer days and delivers water when we have high transpiration rates. So that was very nerve-wracking. It turns out last year and this year, we weathered those conditions, no problem. The vines were fine. But then going into spring, it was late start, and tremendous amount of rain, well above normal. Yeah, I was feeling this year like, wow, this feels like climate change. Like it was a lot of rain, especially for Oliver Soyuz area. And where we are, we're very much like Soyuz, quite dry. And oftentimes rain bypasses our vineyards. So yeah, I was really surprised at how much rain we had this year. And so that favored vegetative growth. And the good thing about that is we had beautiful acids in the berries. At fruit set, we had fairly dry conditions. So we were able to get through fruit set relatively unscathed. We were down about 15% on fruit yields across the board, but not bad. But berry size was small. So going into summer, we were quite late. I felt like summer didn't start till mid-July. I felt like, wow, not only do we have a pandemic, we're not going to have a summer either. So it's kind of delayed. But then summer started mid-July and it was really warm. In fact, I would say it felt hot. And what was really surprising is Veraison was quite delayed and extended. And I think it's just because we had really warm nights. You know, normally around mid-August, the temperatures start to drop and you start to feel like the first hint of cool fall weather. And we didn't get that. It stayed warm through the nights right into September. And September for us, especially with red wine production, is make or break. We absolutely have to have beautiful weather just past Veraison in early September. And we did. It was delivered in spades. But despite that, we were a good 2 weeks late on all our varieties. Our early mid-season ripening varieties, Merlot, Malbec, we picked those. The Merlot actually was 3 weeks late. Normally it's so early. And in fact, oftentimes I think it's too warm where we are for Merlot. We were 3 weeks late and picking into early October. So normally we're picking early September. And the Malbec was mid-October. But Cab Franc and Cab Sauv, even though they had great sugar accumulation and lots of anthocyanins, because we were starting to see cool nights now and really good development of color, the phenological ripeness or the polymerization of tannins was like it was stalled. It wasn't happening. And so I had to hang the fruit till really late. And in fact, it wasn't until we got very cold -4 temperatures that it kind of triggered the grapes to finally complete. And then, you know, about 4 or 5 days after that frost, we picked. And I was very happy with the fruit at that point, but it was a long time coming.
And okay, that's something very interesting that you just said about how the -4 temperature sort of signaled to the grapes, come on, you guys, it's now or never. Like, I know we've had a great warm fall, but it's not going to last forever. So if you're going to ripen. I mean, that's very lucky that the vines interpret it that way. Do you think that's an adaptation of the vines to where they're growing, or might you see this in another place in the world if they had a sudden drop in temperature in the fall?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. You know, like it's been really well studied that abscisic acid is stimulated by cold, and you really get that triggering color development and sugar accumulation. But I think that there is something to that, where vines, when they're growing in a region, you know, there are genes that express ripening or trigger ripening can be affected by environment. They're one of the most sensitive crops that can be affected by environmental conditions. And I think that, yeah, as the vine becomes more established over time, and you know, that probably would explain why in a lot of places when they start collecting vine material for propagating, they find that they're getting better and better expression of fruit within that region because they're selecting for wood that is growing really well in that region. So yeah, I think there is something to that. And you know, also I feel like you know, the vines every year the fruit gets ripe, but sometimes it's like right on the last day, like literally the last day. You know, we had snow and we had that big frost before we picked. Same with 2009 when we had a very cold event in early October. It was like the first weekend of Wine Festival, but the fruit was ripe. It was just, we hadn't had time to pick it and bring it into the cellar. So yeah, it's super interesting. You know, it's just very unpredictable. You know, I would have thought, oh, this is fantastic. We're going to have a year where the Cab Franc is going to come in low alcohol potential, like sugars aren't going to be too high, and beautiful tannin development. Well, it didn't happen that way. It came in with very high sugar levels, but beautiful tannin development.
Lovely. And I can't wait to try it, the 3 different vineyards and see what you do in the future. Are those do those manifest as 3 different styles of Cabernet Franc, or, you know, what's going to happen in the future? That'll be so interesting to see.
Yes, yes, please. Yeah, stay tuned.
I'll be there. All right. So I think I see quite a few questions coming in. So I want to give the audience some time with their questions. Just let me go through here.
Can I start? Val, when did you
Yes.
actually finish picking?
October 29th is when I finished picking. And normally I would do 2 picks for Cabernet Franc because I'm looking to retain the acid, but the acid was so beautiful, I didn't need to do an earlier pick. And it was just a matter of waiting for that phenological ripeness. And it happened October 29th. It was like perfect.
Nice. What about you, Kathy?
All right. Oh. And Kathy, we need you. You've
Yeah,
nicely muted yourself. There we go.
I think that I think it was round about second week of November, which is about the edge for us, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the edge for anyone, I think.
I do have a question here from Sid, and something that I think is, you know, we all can speak to loving. It's to you, Graham, based on the weather conditions in 2020. Sounds like a good year for making bubbles. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, definitely. I thought it was a good year for bubbles, and we did some Chardonnay, some sparkling base that came in really, really, really flavorful. It was very nice. The metrics were just a little bit off. Like, it was hard to get it. There was no acid, you know, like right out of the gate. So I think I picked it 8.8 or something like that, around 20 bricks. So we would have actually liked a little bit more acid, and I think it was about 3.2. So yeah, I think really, really flavorful, really rich, more of a full-bodied style. But I think, yeah, it could have been really good. It's hard for me with that too, because it's the small frame of reference for just picking from this piece that had been for the first year. But because the acids were down a little bit, I wouldn't maybe say it would be like the best year ever for sparkling.
Yeah. And the great thing is you can always, you know, blend the vintages and make a perfect assemblage. Graham, I'm going to stick with you because we have some of the media. I don't have it, but some of the media had the Pinot Gris, which we didn't address. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you know, very classic BC Pinot Gris, you know, an amazing variety for us. You know, that again, looking to get it nice balance, soft, smooth. That's actually from West Kelowna. We were down a little bit on our crop here. So I actually took the Pinot Gris from this site and co-fermented it with our Pinot Noir for the rosé this year. And then I was able to get some Pinot Noir from some old friends on Smith Creek Road, the Volcanic Hills family. And grapes I'd worked with a long time ago. I guess that would have been early 2000s. So yeah, that it's on own roots. So it took quite a while to ripen. Didn't come in until, I wrote it down. Actually picked that on October 15th, October 20th, around there. So a little bit later ripening. Again, a little bit lower alcohol. But I think for that style and for BC, it's wines that people really enjoy drinking. And yeah, we can't seem to really get enough Pinot Gris in.
And I think, honestly, I think we make Pinot Gris as well as anybody. I honestly do, in various terroir across BC. You mentioned own rooted, so of course that's a flag. And I would love to put this out to the panelists. What do you think the future opportunities are, and is it even worth exploring for own rooted vines in the Okanagan?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I've been where we are, and you know, the first story I told about winter damage, you know, we had plants that freeze to the graft union. So my gut instinct was that it would be smart to get into some own rooted. When I was with Mount Boucherie back in the day, we had a lot of own rooted vines, and they did really well. The downside, I mean, obviously could be Phloxera nematodes, but the bigger downside is a little bit later ripening. But that can be an upside as well too, as we're talking about a year like this. Pinot Gris is a perfect example, actually. A lot of times if you have, not too much crop on in a really hot year, it gets super ripe, really high sugar, and ends up making kind of a thin wine. And, this industry could be accused of making that from time to time, myself included. But if you have a little bit more concentrated flavor, concentrated berries, smaller berries, and you're able to hang it longer into the year, and you really want the grapes to be ripening, not when it's super hot, but that's why, like Val said, September is the key month, sort of sub 25 degrees. So the own rooted thing can really, really work. And, and also if there is that, genetic learning of the plants, then that would make sense as well to do own rooted plants from your own vineyards. And that could really be the wave of the future. So we're going to play around with that a little bit for sure right now.
I would add too, Graham, that especially with Pinot Gris, that acid balance is really critical, right? And so keeping a low pH and the acidity in the fruit until harvest is make or break in some areas, right?
Yeah, I feel that the rootstocks are actually super critical for how expressive the fruit is, or to really get the best expression of fruit. And I found that it's been superior to self-rooted vines. Although for survivability, for sure, self-rooted vines definitely will survive cold events, but there's been so few, and I've seen so little damage where vines have died to the ground. But it's more common, Graham, in your region and north, but from Penticton south, it's not an issue.
And is there a difference as far as propagation? Can you do it? Is it for the logistics of the propagation? Is it easier if you can plant on vines, or you still have to go through a process for it?
No, it's easier because you can do them yourself, or you can get someone to do them for you, because you don't have to have the graft union. You don't have to be growing rootstock in order to make the plants. So.
Cool.
Yeah,
and please go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say for Masal selections, like if you're pulling, wood from a vineyard where you see very good expression of fruit, it's a nice way to develop more native expressions of fruit, or native clones. It's sort of like you're selecting wood that does well within your vineyard site. So that's a very interesting way to propagate more local clonal material.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's, all of these things, and not that we're going to go 100% own rooted, and in some cases it works and in some it doesn't, but I love this sort of continuing phase of experimentation, and the wines just getting more and more interesting. As we know, you've made really interesting wines for a long time, and now to see this focus on the GIs, to experiment in things like own rooted, to really look at, okay, how does this vintage manifest in my vineyards? The individuality and the specialness of the wines, I feel we're just entering another stage. Would you think that's fair for the wines that you're all making?
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's true, but also because of where we are, just because of the age of the vines, and I'm sure we all see differences year on year, just as those vines are in the ground longer, and we don't even know where it could go from here. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that makes sense. And all right, I'm just looking and I apologize for the audience. If you wrote a question early on, it may have got lost in the shuffle. So feel free to write it again, and sort of looking from the last backwards. And I see a compliment on your Cabernet Franc Rosé, Val, which you and I haven't talked about here, but I know this is, we wanted to talk about red wines, and that's what you do, but interesting to hear you say that really Cabernet Franc in maybe several different manifestations is going to be the future for the winery. Do you want to take a moment to talk about the Rosé?
Yeah, actually, I thought this was a good example of the year, or the challenges that I faced dealing with Cabernet Franc, because there's two ways of making rosé. I usually do direct press, so the fruit's brought in and it's handled more like a white grape, where it's pressed off the skins, and then the juice fermented very clean. But in this case, the focus was to pick the fruit for the red wine program, so a very different focus than rosé. And when the must was crushed, we have the tank with must, it was drained after 12 hours. And then that juice was taken and fermented separately, fermented fairly cool and on fine lees. And the reason for that is that the wines at Gold Hill are meant to be much bolder and bigger in expression and much more fruit forward. And this rosé fits that style. And for our customers, that's something that they really look for. And fermented cool because we had very high alcohol potential. And basically the fermentation was stopped when I felt like alcohol was as high as it could go and still be drinkable. But I feel like this works. This is a nice wine to have with food. It's pretty big bodied. It can be your winter red or your
Winter
summer
white.
red and your winter white. Yes, but this was an example of dealing with what the climate gives you, like the style. We were still trying to approach the same style, but it was very, the sugar accumulation was unbelievable. And the tannins were very ripe, and so that was why it was drained so quickly after 12 hours. Otherwise, it would have been too colored.
And it's interesting. It has lots of flavor too. I mean, as you say, it's really whatever you said that was complicated, but a red. Yes, it's a red rosé.
Summer
red. Summer red, winter white. And it's really quite delicious. You think about food and you think about power, and so often now, and I love them, don't get me wrong, is the Provence style of, you can barely tell that it's got pink to it. It's dry, it's very light on the palate. I can drink gallons of that, don't get me wrong, but to have a purposeful rosé that, as you say, really does it speaks to the climate, speaks to the vintage, speaks to the area, and it's warm. And full-bodied and meant to go with food. So that's a very honest and exciting wine. Any more questions from the audience here? Lots of compliments to the panelists and of the wines. Oh, okay. Here's one. Does vintage of the decade? Oh, this is a bit complicated, but maybe the panelists will. Does vintage of the decade refer to 2020 to 29 or the past 10 years? If this was the Bordelais, they'd already be predicting which is the vintage of the decade several years in advance. I would answer that as 20 to 29 because things just get better and more interesting and more delicious every year or so.
I feel like there is no vintage of the century because which wine are you talking about and what is the style? It's like every vintage delivers something different or features a different wine. So that's a really hard question for such a diverse industry.
I think it's an impossible question, and it's always a great phrase, and it's something that we use in winemaking. But you're right, the diversity in mesoclimate, the diversity in grape varieties and styles of wine that we make. It's a vintage of the century. It's the vintage of a decade for some wine all the time, right? We have just 1 minute left for one question. Lots of thank yous. It was fun. Sorry, I don't know what was going on with the audio at the beginning, but you'll all have a copy of the presentation and the data that you can see. So, just wait a second. Question, Val. Did you see it, Val, before it popped away?
Barb, there is one question here.
You got it? Okay.
Just on your last comment on the vintage of the decade and looking at the different varietals, David Laurison's asking, any particular variety or varieties that come off particularly well in 2020 to all the panelists?
It's too soon to tell. Come on.
I think Syrah and Cabernet Franc.
Yeah, hard for me to say with new job and new grapes here, but I would say our Chardonnay Rieslings came in really great. So for me, those were kind of the stars. For vintage of the decade, I would say for Kathy, you have to be done before Halloween if it's going to be a vintage of the decade.
That almost never happens. We planted Cab Sauv on the Naramata Bench.
Oh, right.
And we're going to get it right no matter what.
I was just looking at the chat. Barb was asking, how are things going this year, Barb Wild? And I was thinking back when we were talking about spring last year and how different it's been this year. Like we've had, I think, seriously, something like 4 mils of rain this whole year. And last year we were getting that in, 2 storms a week, we would get 4 mils. I mean, so it's been pretty crazy this year. It's been so warm and nice, a little bit windy at times, but it's, been game on. It's been growing really well for a while. So it's a complete polar opposite of last year. And of course, the first thing you learn is don't get excited because it just means that something's going to change.
Anything could
But
happen.
the data shows a week to 10 days ahead of last year for bud break. So
Yeah.
Same.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, well, keep it going and we'll see what happens for the rest of the season. Kathy, Val, Graham, thank you so much for coming on the program today. It was a lot of fun to get a little teeny tiny bit of the inside track. And we do look forward to seeing you soon. And media sommeliers who are watching, we hope that you'll be back next week. And panelists, you are invited as well when we'll take a virtual trip to the Kootenays and the Fraser Valley and up to what sometimes feels like the edge of the earth in Lillooet. So it should be really fun.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
thanks so much, Barb.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon. Come visit.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.